In our first lecture, we looked at Skinner's argument, why his radical behaviorism or his functional analysis approach to psychology should be the exclusive approach to explaining behavior within psychology. Then we looked at Chomsky's review of Skinner's attempt to extrapolate that approach into the explanation of learning and use of language in his review of verbal behavior. In this lecture, we want to step back and take a larger look and see how the sorts of criticisms that we see emerging in Chomsky's review of verbal behavior are criticisms that really are valid criticisms being recognized by people in psychology and in other intellectual disciplines that don't necessarily result in the abandonment of behaviorism, but rather the reconceptualization of the significance of classical and operant conditioning in an overall schema for understanding and explaining human and animal mentality and behavior. And specifically, we want to look at these with an eye to trying to understand why it was or how it was that these led from a relatively non-cognitive approach to understanding psychological phenomenon to a relatively cognitive or information processing approach that we see emerging in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. 4 general difficulties emerge for behaviorism. So I sort of jokingly refer to this lecture as the 4 horsemen of behaviorism. The first difficulty is the difficulty of stimulus generalization. That is, how to best go about categorizing stimuli and response if we're going to try and understand all of our behavior in terms of the manifestation of learned stimulus-response associations. The second problem is often referred to as poverty of the stimulus or poverty of stimulus, and this questions whether or not or how these 2 mechanisms of classical and operant conditioning can explain the complexity and variability of behaviors given the incredibly impoverished set of training stimuli that you might see a particular animal exposed to relative to the range of potential responses and variabilities and complexities of those responses. The third problem, I have a hard time saying concisely, just focuses in on whether or not classical or operant conditioning mechanisms are adequate for helping us to understand learning and resulting behaviors for many cognitive tasks. And finally, the fourth difficulty asks whether or not response strength, just relationships, probabilistic relationships between stimulus and response, are going to be adequate to explain a sufficient amount of the variability that we see in behaviors, both in terms of their complexity and in terms of just the variability of a response to a given stimulus. So let's turn our attention then to that first topic, stimulus generalization. So we can extrapolate away from theorists like Dewey or Kohler or Chomsky and use what they say to formulate 4 major problems for methodological behaviorism. The first of these problems is that behaviorists face a categorization problem. How does one or can one identify various stimuli or responses as belonging to the same category of stimuli or response for the purposes of formulating and testing theories of conditioning history? And psychologists usually refer to this problem as the problem of stimulus generalization. Now, in simple cases of maze learning or pecking based on color or shape, researchers can manage stimulus generalization fairly well. They're looking at a pretty well-defined stimulus-response association that's being cultivated explicitly for the purposes of experimentation. However, when we get to cases like Tolman's rats, they seem to generalize in a manner that eludes any reasonable categorization based on stimulus features. Why does Tolman's rat go down the radial arm of the new maze in the general direction of where the old reward was, not because of the way that the maze looks in any description whatsoever. Language likewise provides the sort of stimulus and response set that renders stimulus generalization much, much more problematic. To start, most sentences that a language user encounters each day are going to be completely novel, and most of the sentences that they utter are going to be sentences that they've never uttered before. If you think about just the sentences in this slide, you've probably seen none of them in your entire life. And the sentences that you might write in your short answer response are probably sentences that you've never penned before. Because of that tremendous percentage of novelty, trying to understand that behavior in terms of past associations between stimulus and response becomes extremely difficult. And it's compounded further because these utterances are complex, both in terms of their content and in terms of their structure. And their complexity is important to processing them appropriately. So just by changing the position of a word in a sentence, we change the meaning of the sentence. So these all pose tremendous problems for trying to come up with characterizations of here's a stimulus kind and here's a response kind that would prove anywhere near adequate for explaining this novel, complex phenomenon that is language learning and use.